So now moving to our third deputation of the morning, Hugo Christensen, representing the South Brighton Residents Association. Hugo, thank you for joining us. Welcome to the table. You also have 10 minutes to speak with us this morning. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, and thank you all for this opportunity to again express our concerns about the endless delays of the recovery. One part of South Brighton appears to be forced into a system designed to address future sea level rise. Some areas of the suburb have subsided, equivalent to about 100 years of sea level rise through land subsidence. The damage was caused by the earthquakes. The damage was insured. And we hope that lessons can be learned from the past. In places where strong earthquakes strike, they are likely to strike again. And the effect of further earthquakes of the magnitude experienced in 2011 would be horrendous in the eastern suburbs. Throughout the period following the earthquake, the South Brighton Residents Association has repeatedly brought to your attention the misreporting of information relating to the damage caused by the earthquakes. Regenerate Christchurch and the Community Board have shown no interest in investigating the errors we pointed out in 2017. That's where the regeneration was handled from Regenerate back to Council. It's gone back to Regenerate, and we are now in a position where it's going to be pushed back again. Significant resources have been allocated to produce unreliable information that is totally unsuited for decision-making purposes pursuant to Section 71 to 86 of the Local Government Act. Particularly reprehensible is the fact that this relates to life safety for vulnerable people who have been left behind the so-called recovery. We therefore urgently request a proper assessment of hazards in compliance with the NZS 31,000-2018 risk management principles and guidelines. An assessment of the annual fatality risk should be carried out before any further action is taken. In detail, we request the following: identification and quantification of tectonic subsidence, land subsidence in terms of the Christchurch City datum, fault lines in the South Brighton area, the seismic risk, the increased flood risk, the current flood risk, the calculated velocity of water based on land elevation, drainage points versus top of high tide, and tsunami risk, and the consequences of a 1 in 50-year tsunami at a high tide based on current land elevation. So, we have provided information to you here which actually contradict what Council is using for their assessment of life safety. We produced the bigger picture which shows the actual elevation of the area on the South Brighton Spit. And what you can see there is that the area of South Shore is at much higher elevation than the area in South Brighton. Just to make this very simple, we put some gumboots in front of the flood protection just to show you what this looks like in relation to human being. And when you look at the area in South Brighton, where you see the elevation is the lowest in the city and well below the high tide, you can imagine a person in these gumboots, an adult person would not withstand the Pacific Ocean breaking through, and that is something that will eventually happen. And people have been put in this position. They are waiting for this to happen. They are being told by everyone. They're scared shitless. Sorry for the language. They are scared. and they are left to face this. And we are being told that there's no flood risk. So I ask you guys to, stop concerning yourselves about the risk that Christchurch City Council is facing and address the people that have been left there. So the risk to council is one thing, but the risk to human lives following a disaster is of higher importance. At the back side of this document, there is a reference to evidence of Janice Carter, which submitted on behalf of Christchurch City Council. He goes into detail about the assessment of risk to life. And what we have here in Christchurch is that risk to life has been assessed in the Port Hills. But somehow someone made the decision that the risk to life is of less consequences in the coastal areas than it is on the Port Hills. This is not acceptable. You have a system in place here, which was introduced by Wendy Saunders, which is referred to in Janice Carter's submission, which calls for an immediate action if risk to life is in excess of international standards. People should be held accountable and action should be taken, not as per your proposed plan to leave the decision till August or continue to delay these difficult positions. You're dealing with human beings, human rights have been breached, and we would like to see some actual action here, not a delay 5 minutes before the next elections. We would like to see you guys to step up and deal with this situation. So I would love to answer some questions in regard to this.
That's great. Thank you very much. And thanks for drawing attention to this handout that you'd provided before the meeting as well. So that does leave us about 3 minutes for questions. Other questions for Hugo? Dion.
Well, I just want to understand, in light of what the last speakers was speaking about, the amount of time and effort that you, in your situation and the people around you have put in, what's been the impact that this long, drawn-out process so far has had on yourselves and others around you?
It is a total nightmare. We've been fighting brick walls for many, many years, dealing with multiple authorities, ministers, and it's a brick wall. We have applied for funding for the Residents Association, and when we introduced this particular information and we requested funding to do further investigation and reporting, we were asked to withdraw our application for funding, and we never received any funding. And we've been starved of funding, and this has had very, very significant impact on our lives, on our communities, and it's devastating. This has been documented in the newspapers here. This is not what we should be expecting after a disaster.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed, Hugo, for once again taking the time to come along and address the Council. As with the other submitters, the points that you've made are very, very clear. Thanks for taking the time to come and talk to us this morning. Thank you.
Thank you.
So now I'd call our fourth deputation to the table, representing Empowered Christchurch Limited, Seamus O'Crontha. So as with the other deputations, you have 10 minutes, and if you choose to allow time for questions, obviously that's something for you to choose to do. Thank you.
Thank you. Kia ora, kia tau. I'm representing Empowered Christchurch. Just to make clear, we're not restricted to the South Brighton, South Shore area. We have members from many different parts of Christchurch and beyond. But obviously the discussion today is on the problems relating to the Brighton area. So you've had deputations from medical practitioners, residents associations, so I won't waste time by going over things that have already been said, but I'll try to respond to some questions that have been posed by councillors over the last week, just to clarify some things. Firstly, it's clear that we are at a crisis point here from what you've heard this morning. Communities have been fighting for their survival for the last 10 years. We are now at the point where many people don't know what to do because they have been blocked, because no decisions have been made. And I think at the root of things is land damage. Most of these problems relate to the fact that nothing was done by EQC and nothing was done by council after the earthquakes to raise land to protect it from erosion, flooding, high groundwater, and all the other problems that we see today. Discussions were held between EQC and council in 2014, proposing area-wide mitigation. Nothing was done on this matter, and this is why we are in the position we are in today. One councillor asked about the ISO 31000 risk standard. So just to explain that, if you take the example of the Port Hills, you decide what the risk to life is, and according to the ISO standard, if you have a risk of 1 in 10,000 of a fatality over the course of the year, that is intolerable. And that is the reason why homes were red stickered in the Port Hills. So if you contrast that with the coastal areas in Christchurch and in Canterbury generally, you have seismic risk, you have high groundwater, you have erosion, you have lateral spreading, you have liquefaction, you have insurance problems on top of that, which is not a natural hazard, but all of these problems combined, there must be a risk which is higher than 1 in 10,000. Therefore, the risk must be seen as intolerable. Therefore, action must be taken to mitigate or eliminate that risk. This is what we have not seen from the council or any of the responsible authorities over the last 9 years. Risk-based planning is another thing that we should clarify. So risk-based planning says that rather like a triage system in a medical emergency, you look at the most vulnerable people, the people who are at risk most, and deal with them. I did a Red Cross training course many years ago in Christchurch, and one of the interesting things that our trainer told us was in a multiple pile-up situation, you do not pay attention to the people who are screaming loudly. You go to the people who are quiet, because they are the ones who cannot express what they are feeling. So it's rather the same here. The real victims of this situation are not myself and other people who are shouting loudly. They are the vulnerable people who have been left and swept aside, the people that Dr. Cook referred to earlier. So on the basis of risk-based planning, you should look after a fire that is beside an oil depot before you look at a fire which is in a quarry or a brickworks. That makes complete sense. The other matter I would like to point out is insurability. This is a huge financial problem for many people in the coastal areas, and it's the result of the whole recovery process where houses were not repaired, land was not repaired, and people do not have insurance. There is a growing pool of houses which are both earthquake prone, which should attract a higher risk assessment under the ISO standard than for life fatality risk. But this has not been done. More and more people have no insurance. More and more houses in the coastal areas are being sold and snapped up by speculators. And we're at the point where decisions have to be taken to spend a lot of money to safeguard people, to rescue the situation. This is a unique opportunity because you're in the middle of negotiating with the Crown. To go back in history, in 2014, Tonkin and Taylor estimated that land damage, the costs for EQC, would amount to $2.14 billion. They then revised this down by shaving a little off here, shaving a little off there. Then they introduced diminution of value. So This is particularly important for coastal properties. If you were at risk of flooding, EQC paid on average $25,000 per property and left people with the risk. The land was not remediated. The result of that is they have no insurance today. They have no mortgages today. So it's only a question of time before banks pull out, insurance pulls out, people are flooding, and they don't have the money to pay for it. Everything that they have saved for during their lives is gone, and their children and their families have no future. So I would ask, in the negotiations with Crown, ask where the money went for land remediation, which was estimated at $2.14 billion. Why was $525 million released to the Crown in the midst of the suffering in Christchurch? All of this money is really money that was stolen from what people should have received in the earthquake recovery and has disappeared. So in negotiations, ask the Crown, who's going to pay for this? Because otherwise, this will be an explosive disaster which will get worse and worse and worse. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Questions? Dion.
Yeah, I'm glad that you mentioned the payments from EQC on the increased land and flooding vulnerabilities. Do you think that process was wrong or not right? And the reason I'm asking is that there's the EQC inquiry at the moment where these feedback need to be also fed back into so that we don't do this again. But do you think this has increased the problems that we're seeing now?
Massively. I attended the EQC Land Community Information meetings, which they held, I think it was 2016, if I remember correctly. They produced an incredibly arcane, complicated, incomprehensible system to explain how they were going to pay for increased liquefaction vulnerability based on a matrix, based on the value of properties before and after the earthquakes, based on technical reports from Tonkin and Taylor, which we now know left out key information and downplayed the actual damage. So yes, I think it's a huge influencing factor.
Make sure you feed that into the EQC inquiry as well.
We have made a detailed submission to the EQC inquiry, and we'll be meeting with Dame Sylvia later this month.
Thank you. Pauline.
Yeah, excuse me if I'm being ignorant here, but can the land be remediated, and how would that happen?
If you ask a structural engineer or a geotechnical engineer, all land can be remediated, but it's a question of what that will cost. And I think in the coastal suburbs, when you look at the condition of the soil, sandy, silty, it would be extremely expensive to remediate it. So this is why EQC has run away from the problem, and this is why we're in the situation we're in today. I think it would be horrendously expensive to do area-wide remediation, but if you're asking, I think one councillor asked during the week what proposals we could make to solve the problem. It seems to me that certain properties have to be retreated from. You cannot protect them. You have a temporary stop bank which has to be moved inland to provide more of a buffer zone. That is the least expensive solution to the problem. Provide protection where possible, where it makes sense for the next 100 years. Relocate people where it's too expensive and doesn't make sense for economic and social reasons.
And have you got any idea how many houses we might be talking about if you're looking at, relocating?
Well, a lot of the most immediate risk affects what is coincidentally or not coincidentally the residential unit overlay. So this was recently introduced by council. This has allowed people to rebuild without resource consents, which would make them build at higher levels and give them more protection. Mm-hmm. It also lets council off the hook because they would have a hazard notice if they built at lower level, and they would not be liable in the case of flooding. So I think a lot of the residential unit overlay will be the area affected on the estuary side to the centre, roughly, of the Brighton Peninsula.
Thank you very much indeed. Thanks for the presentation. Thanks for detailed answers to questions as well, and for joining us this morning. Thank you very much indeed.